Welcome to the AES Melbourne October meeting, being held in November for a change. My name is Graham Huon. Tonight we're very pleased to have David Lauritsen to talk to us on the topic of video game design and curriculum implications. David has both broad-ranging and detailed qualifications, knowledge and experience in audio, media production and in music. David gained a Bachelor of Sciences degree, majoring in mathematics in 2012, then went on to achieve a Bachelor of Audio Engineering in 2015 and a Master's in Creative Industries qualification in 2021. David is also a musician and author and has published The Handbook for the Serious Guitarist in 2016. He has worked in multiple recording studios, operated as a production sound mixer, post-production engineer, and has lectured and developed the curriculum at the JMC Academy in Melbourne. In 2022, he joined Big Ant Studios, one of the larger video game companies in Australia. Tonight, David will inform us on the gaming industry from a development perspective, especially from essential audio aspects, take us through the challenges of sound design specifically for the gaming environment. He will explain from an educator's perspective the skill sets and the emergent and quite different approach to curriculum needed for gaming industry development, and will give some pointers on how to enter the field. I would like you to welcome David. Where is he? I'd like you to welcome David to the stage for what will be a most interesting presentation, I'm sure. Thank you, David. Now, that's your microphone.
Thank you for that. That's quite the introduction. Sounds like a lot when it's all listed out like that. Yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. Thanks to Melbourne Polytechnic for hosting this thing. I'll be talking about video game sound design and designing curriculum around that topic. Just before I get started, I'm definitely not a questions at the end kind of guy, so if you have any questions as you're going, feel free to raise a hand or call out or ball up a piece of paper and throw it at me, whatever to get my attention. And yeah, I'll repeat the question back so everyone can hear it, because we're joined by some people on remoting in on YouTube, I believe. And questions aren't limited to people in the room. We've also thought about the people on YouTube. I've got a screen here where I can see the comments. So if anyone has a question, hopefully I'll see it when I glance over here, but please feel free to include yourselves in that. And lastly, the third category of people listening to this are people watching the recording back. And I asked the AV guys whether they can set up some sort of pipeline where questions can be beamed back from the future, and they said it was too hard. I don't know, I think they might have just didn't want to do it or something. No, but seriously, obviously that's impossible. But what you can do is you can email me at davidlauritsen1@gmail.com if you have any comments or questions, or if you just want to send a picture of your dog or tell me what your favourite microphone is. Actually, that's a good idea, isn't it? Maybe that can be the required format for correspondence. Say hello. If you have a dog, picture of your dog, favourite microphone, and then your question or comment. That'd be a good format. I would really enjoy that. Just going to have a sip of water before I get started. Very necessary. All right. So this is probably the part of the presentation that I was dreading. So I'm really not good at talking about myself. I never have been. But I will for you, because I think it is necessary for you to sort of know where I'm coming from with this sort of thing. You know, it definitely informs the context of the presentation. So deep breath, me, not you, and let's have a look. Like Graham mentioned, I was a musician first, and it's probably quite a typical introduction to audio, coming from a musical background. there's lots of chance to interface with audio when you're a musician. This About Me section is not in chronological order, by the way. It's sort of by category. I was in a hard rock band for quite some years. We probably played about 200 shows. The biggest of which was the Big Day Out, which is pretty awesome. That was like the high point of the musical career. This is actually the last Big Day Out ever, so I like to make the joke that we killed it. And then there's a funny story, like there was like an outside chance of playing Soundwave that same year, and one of my friends said, like, Big Day Out is one thing, but if you end Soundwave, I'm going to kill you. But then Soundwave did end, but not because of us. 2016, I self-published a book called Handbook for the Serious Guitarist, which did quite well. It was an independent release, but it was good fun. It's definitely good fun writing. And yeah, shout out to Shub Guitars, who built my pride and joy over here. When I had it built, the brand was called 2012 Guitars. They changed the name to Shub Guitars, presumably after 2012, which I guess makes sense. So getting into audio, I was a guitarist my whole life. I started at age 6. And I feel like I started in audio in 2008. Over here on the right, guitarists might know what this is. This is a Fractal Audio Axe-Fx. If you're not sure what that is, it's a hardware unit that does digital modelling of guitar amplifiers. That might not sound like such a special thing, but certainly back then this was a bit of a game changer, I guess. And the reason why I'm talking about it is because this is sort of my first introduction to some of the audio engineering lingo, because these things are pretty dense, pretty deep. It was the first time that I was learning to EQ by frequency. It was my first time with a parametric EQ and a graphic EQ. The compressor module is sort of interface similar to a DAW with like threshold and attack and release and that sort of thing. So diving into that thing, I feel, is what got me started in audio, to the extent where it gave me the confidence to get Pro Tools in the same year. I started on Pro Tools 8, but I couldn't find an image of Pro Tools 8. That's why I crossed it out. I think it's maybe because Pro Tools 8 didn't have the number 8. Anyway. And then in the same year, it's a busy year, right? Then in the same year, I asked my mum for speakers to mix on. And I probably didn't explain that speakers typically come in pairs. So I just got one speaker, and I was very happy with that one speaker. But for the first half of the next year, I was mixing all in mono. I had headphones, but someone told me once that you can't mix with headphones, it's got to be speakers, and I didn't know any better, so I was like, okay. I was mixing in mono. And then when I finally got the second speaker, about 6 months later, the first experience of like panning one guitar right and one guitar left, it's like, oh my God, that's so easy. It's like cheating. I couldn't believe it. But yeah, mixing mono, it was a great way to start, actually. My education, Graham ran through, but a Bachelor of Science from Monash, finishing in 2012. And, all that time I was dabbling with audio. Audio was always like a hobby back then. I never really imagined it as a career, but just sort of mixing. I was in the band throughout that time, doing shows, doing live sound for friends' bands here and there, just doing demo recordings, really. And then after that finished up, I enrolled in an audio engineering degree at JMC Academy, and I did 2/3 of the degree and then stopped. So that took me to 2014, and that was when I was starting to get a bit of work as a freelancer. So the first studio I worked at was Colour Sound Studios, which still exists. It's in Altona. It's a really great little studio. And I was also doing film audio. I bought a boom and a zoom, Boom Zoom, and I was doing independent short films and that sort of thing, starting from 2014. Later on, about a year later, I went back to finish the degree, which was the best decision I ever made. You know, my intention was not to go back, actually, but I'm so glad that I did, because it was fantastic. Those last 2 semesters of it were awesome. And then, I got my master's through COVID. So my master's was dealing with ambisonics, specifically the utilization of ambisonics, not for immersive media, but for traditional sort of stereo media. So using ambisonics in this sort of non-traditional way. Hopefully that makes sense. So 2016 is where there was the first year that I found myself kind of earning more money from audio than other jobs. And I know that might seem like a kind of a tacky thing to talk about in a presentation, but it was a really important milestone for myself. You know, all this time, my dream was to make a living from either music or audio. By this time in 2016, I was sort of done with music. I really wanted to do audio. But, you know, leading up to that, my dream was to have an income from audio or music. And so that was a really important milestone for me, 2016 there. 2017, I started working at Black Pearl Studios, which has an incredible range of microphones and outboard gear. It was a real pleasure to work at. And I started teaching in 2018. So taught various subjects over the years. Then in 2019, I was full-time as head lecturer, working with Dan Bodnachuk over there, which was fantastic, and that took us into COVID, and I was teaching online and that sort of thing. And throughout COVID, we redeveloped our audio course at JMC. So I wrote 3 units and then helped write 2 or 3 more. So quite a bit of curriculum development going in there. Over here, you know, I did a lot of film projects over the years, but these are 2 that really stand out to me. The Art of Incarceration, that was my first Netflix release. It's a documentary, should be available on Netflix still. I haven't checked though, they seem to kind of come and go, don't they? But yeah, that was a really special project for me. And that took years, that was like 5 years in production. And then a couple of years ago, Wog Boys 3, I was a dialogue editor on. That's probably the biggest film that I've worked on, so that was a real pleasure to be a part of that. And then in 2022, I got into the video games industry as a sound designer, working at Big Ant Studios. And since then, we've released 2 titles, AFL 23 and Cricket 24, and we've got a couple more on the way. And yeah, that's my introduction. Just going to have another sip of water. Should just leave the lid off. Cool. All right. So that's me done talking about myself. So the context of this presentation is what is video game audio? How is it different from other forms of sound design, which is in turn, how is it different from audio engineering? So I'm going to be trying to cover all of these sorts of things. And yeah, a big context is, you know, how do we engage students in this field? How do we train students to be able to step into one of these sorts of roles? And how do we inform the curriculum development thereof? So yeah, audio engineering degrees, they typically have at least 1 film and television unit, sometimes 2 or 3, but they've always kind of felt like a little bit of an afterthought to me. Certainly when I was studying, the film and television units sort of felt like a bit of an afterthought. And as for game audio, a lot of degrees do have a game audio unit, but not all of them do. And they're not required to for the most part. So one thing that I've definitely noticed is that audio engineering students and recent graduates, whether it be in a project or like a demo reel or something on an application, I've noticed that there's a tendency to lean really heavily on music in sound design. And so that sort of indicates to me that the message perhaps isn't really getting across as to what the craft is and what it should be and what employers are looking for with this sort of thing. And yeah, in bold right here, this is probably the anecdotal finding that kind of inspires this whole presentation, and is that you know, people who work in this industry typically get their skills outside of university, which was certainly my case. You know, I have a Bachelor of Audio Engineering, but a lot of the skills that I've obtained to get me the job, I learned outside of the degree. So I feel like this is something that should probably change. Am I making sense so far? All good? Cool. Further context, video game sound design is one of the few areas of audio engineering for which there are full-time roles. So it's very encouraging. It's a booming industry. I've written here, insert game valuation statistic. I feel like it's a bit tacky to just put statistics that I found on Google. But needless to say that it's a giant industry and it's definitely growing. One way that it is growing is that Screen Australia have announced funding schemes for that sort of mid-tier to high mid-tier independent game production. I feel this is really important. Screen Australia, I think, has been pivotal in advancing the careers of crew in the film and television world. You know, there's lots of Australian productions that had funding through Screen Australia, and it's allowed people like me to be able to get paid positions on those TV shows or films. And the fact that same sort of ecosystem might be moving to the game world is really good, because it means that sound designers can get paid for their work on these sort of mid-tier productions. So it's only going to advance the industry and give more opportunities to more people. Leading up to this presentation, Dan asked me if the stick figures are going to make an appearance. These are the stick figures, if anyone overheard that. It's sort of been a staple of my lessons over the years. Cool. So a little bit about sound design, not necessarily to do with games, but sound design in general. That could mean film and television, radio, podcast, that sort of thing. I had a bit of a think about this, and I sort of boiled down the process of sound design into 3 categories. And I have an example for these 3 categories. And hopefully this sort of illustrates kind of what we do on a daily basis. So the three approaches, let's say, to sound design, starting from probably the most simple to the most complex. Number 1 is to record the same object. So let's say there's an animation and 2 characters shake hands, you know, and you're required to make a sound for that. Well, that's pretty straightforward. You set up a microphone and there you go, right? It's a very simple process. You just replicate the exact same thing in the manner that it's presented. So that's pretty straightforward. That's approach number 1. Approach number 2 would be to do that same thing but use a recording that someone else has made. And you might use this through a sound library, because maybe you don't have access to the object or the prop that you're meant to be recreating. I forget what this is. I think I Googled howitzer into Google, but I don't think that's a howitzer. But anyway, let's call it a howitzer. That'll do. Let's say there's a howitzer in an animation or a film or something, I don't expect you to have something like that in your garage. And if you did, there's probably a different conversation someone should be having with you. Having said that, though, you could take this approach, and some Hollywood sound designers do this. They will organise with a local army base or something like that to, go on site and record their hardware. So that would be an example of achieving this using approach number 1. But most likely you'll be doing approach number 2, which is find that object in a sound library. So we use sound libraries a lot to source things that are inconvenient or impossible to find ourselves. Now, approach number 3 is probably the most significant. This is probably where we spend the majority of our time, maybe 70 or 80% of our time. And what I've written here is to record, source, or synthesize a sonically equivalent sound. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? So I've got pictures of vegetables here. Now, I'm wondering if anyone knows where I'm going with this. Does anyone want to call out? What do we use vegetables for in sound design? Bones, yes. Breaking bones, that sort of things. The sounds of violence, really, is what we're dealing with. Let's say that in a movie someone breaks a bone. You could go with this option. You could set something up and you've only really got one take at that, and you'll probably ruin the take by screaming. So that's probably not a great way to go. So this is what I mean by choosing something that's sonically equivalent. Really hard vegetables like carrots or parsnips, when you snap them, they kind of have that texture that is convincing on screen. So that's what I mean by finding something that's sonically equivalent. Obviously, it isn't the same thing, but you can pass it off as that thing because there's an equivalence there that we recognize. The other aspect of sound design is representing sounds that don't have a real-world equivalent. My favorite example of this is slow motion, because slow motion doesn't actually exist in the real world. You could argue that slow motion could be a state of mind, perhaps, like if your partner or business partner says that the Behringer C1000 sounds exactly like the Neumann M149 that you just bought. That'll send you spinning into slow motion, right? But apart from that singular example, slow motion doesn't really exist in the real world. And yet so many forms of media have slow motion sequences. It's so common, right? And there's always sound treatment to go along with it. The simplest sound treatment is to just have music and nothing else. But if it's not that, there's always some sort of sound design element, whether it's like a low whoosh or like the voice is going really deep. Some sort of treatment, right? And as consumers of media, we watch these things and our brain is just like, yep, that's what that slow motion sounds like. That makes perfect sense to me. And yet we've never experienced it because it's not a real thing. So yeah, it's up to the sound designer to sort of paint that picture of that sequence in a way that's convincing and of a way that makes sense to us. Other examples of that are science fiction and fantasy elements, like Jurassic Park is a great example. No person alive has actually heard what a dinosaur sounds like, but you watch that movie and all of the sounds, they match the dinosaurs, and our brain's like, yep, that's exactly what it sounds like, but we've never heard it before. And the last thing here, I've written emotionally equivalent sound design. I just threw an example of The Simpsons here because it was the first thing that popped into my head. This sequence here, they're talking about all the dumb things that the town of Springfield has embarked upon, like the elevator that leads to nowhere and the giant popsicle tower on the right and the giant magnifying glass. And I'm not going to play this video, but if you watch it, when they mention the magnifying glass, there's like this pulsing sound, like and you watch it and you don't think anything of it because it sort of emotionally matches what you're seeing. But if you think about it, a magnifying glass doesn't actually make any sound. The fire on the right would make sound, but there's no sound to light going through like an aperture like that. It's an example of a sound designer taking the liberty to insert a sound that isn't realistic, but it's emotionally accurate, if that makes sense. So that's another part of what we do. So I had a bit of a think about the differences between audio engineering in its traditional form and sound design. And I boiled it down to this silly little cartoon. This is us here. It's a little small, isn't it? But we're holding a Neumann because that's how I categorize us. We walk around holding a Neumann. That's what we do. And yeah, I feel like this is a big difference between audio engineering and sound design. Of course, audio engineering takes many forms and facets, so I'm generalizing here. But to me, typically with audio engineering, the source material or the audio comes to us and we process it or make it sound great. Just like the gentleman up the back here. I've brought this sound source into the room and he's making it sound fantastic. With sound design, it's sort of an inverse because the source material comes from us. We're required to bring the source material to the client or whatever it is. I suppose another analogy might be, a sound designer is perhaps more akin to a music producer who has a real hand in crafting the arrangement and bringing instrumentalists in and that sort of thing. That could be another analogy for this. I wish I thought of that and put it in the slide ahead of time, but there you go. Hopefully this makes sense. Cool. So that was sound design, as best as I could kind of illustrate it. With video game sound design, there are a couple of extra complications, let's say, a couple of considerations that we deal with. There's a big system design element to this sort of world, and I have some examples of that coming up. And yeah, a lot of what we do is we design sounds in the way that I've illustrated on the previous slides, and then we collaborate with the more technical sound designers and audio engineers, audio programmers, to come up with a way of systematically implementing these sounds and making sure they fire at the correct time. A lot of what we do is making sure that sounds play when they're meant to, which is no trivial thing. It's a big part of what we do. And because of that, there's a big software development emphasis to the role. Traditionally, sound designers aren't, software people or programmers, but there is that element to it inevitably. So I like to use examples that are quite mundane because, an example as simple as someone walking up to a door and opening it, that sounds like the easiest thing in the world, right? If it was a film, it'd take like 10 minutes or less, 40 seconds maybe in some cases. But yeah, when I was doing this on Cricket 24, it was kind of oddly difficult to implement the sound of someone opening a door. And the main complication was because, I made the sound. The sound was fine. That was very short and sweet. But the complication was when do we actually play it and how do we play it? And we had three options in this case. How it works is before we see this on screen, the scene is loaded, so all those textures like the door and the plants and all of that stuff is loaded. And then there's a cutscene that plays on top of it, or inside of it rather. So that plays at a slightly different time. And then within the cutscene is the animation of the person walking. So there's actually three things happening and three places where we could potentially play the sound. My first thought was to start the sound here, because that's the same point that we start the ambience. We fire off an ambience when we load the scene. That kind of makes sense. But what I was finding was when I play the door sequence when loading the scene, 4 times out of 5 it worked well, but then 20% of the time it was out of sync, and it was really, really frustrating. And it could be for so many reasons. It could be for computer lag, or there's just a mismatch between the time it takes to load the scene and actually start the cutscene. It could be any number of things. And it was odd that it was just like 80% of the time it was great. So then we have the other options of playing the sound, firing the sound off from a different point. So yeah, this is part of the job, figuring out how to play it so that it actually looks and feels right. It's something that we don't really deal with in other forms of audio engineering, because in something like Pro Tools, Pro Tools waits for you. If the computer's slow, it's going to wait until all the tracks are ready and it's going to start playing. You never really have to worry about this. Same with a film. If you have like 90 reverbs in a film mix and you click bounce, the computer slows down to your speed and renders out at 0.7 speed or something like that. But yeah, this is sort of a different ball game, because the game doesn't wait for you. The game's going to keep going, and if your audio is ready, then it's ready. But if it's not, that's it. So yeah, we've got these 3 options, and this is the one we chose. We put the sound tied to the character animation. So without further ado, man walks through door. Hilariously simple, right? But the reason why I'm showing you this is because it should be such a simple thing, but it actually took me a few hours. Yeah. So on to a slightly more complex example of making sure sounds fire at the correct time. We do sports games at Big Ant Studios, so a lot of our sports have commentary. And our commentary system is pretty in-depth. It wasn't built for this game. It's sort of an ongoing system that gets iterated upon game after game. And I definitely didn't build the system. I just used the system and build upon it. Cool. So this is a screen grab from the game with some debug text on screen. A big tool in the game industry is having text on the screen to tell you exactly what's meant to be happening. It's a really useful tool. So we've got the subtitle down here. Players of the game don't usually see this. This is just something that we print to the screen. And it's a bit small, but the file name is here. And this is significant because there's about 12,000 lines of dialogue for the game, and they all have to be meticulously labelled and perfect. And if they're not perfect, then instead of saying, "We're about ready to get underway," you might say, "Great shot." And then it's like, that's not quite right. So yeah, that's an important one. Having access to information to tell you where you went wrong. Over here is the sort of back end of how we select lines of commentary to play. And it's kind of a 2-tiered system. There's the category level, and categories are really broad, what would you say, broad categories of things you might say. Like a category could be hit the ball for 6 or out court, or in this case, pre-delivery. So pre-delivery, we've got our bowler here, he's just about to start running up, and we have a dialogue category called pre-delivery. So that's sort of the top layer of this 2-tiered system. The second tier are these conditions. It might be a little tricky to read, but basically these are all the things that the Oh, you can't see my mouse. These are all the things that the game code is evaluating when we're inside of that category. So things like whether it's the first innings, whether it's the first ball of the match, whether the bowler is the captain, these sorts of things. So we manage our dialogue lines through a spreadsheet, and these are maybe 30-odd lines from the pre-delivery category. And over here, sorry, you're not seeing my mouse. Over here are the conditions. And I know it's a bit small, but if you could see it, you'd see that these categories here are the ones that came up in green on our debug menu here. So based on all that information, any of these 4 lines could have played. And the one that I've highlighted there, we're about ready to get underway. That's the one that played. So I can't help but imitate David Gow when he does these, because I've heard them so many times. Like, I see the line and I can't help but hear how he says it in his head. And he's also British and I can't do accents, so that's why it sounded odd. So another example, we've got this other category called ball result. So, you hit the ball or you don't hit the ball, and it's a category that tells us about the result of the ball, whether you hit it, whether you didn't, whether you're out, whether you scored runs. And you can see that there's a lot more stuff that gets evaluated in this one. There's a whole bunch of data that it churns through in order to select a line. And the ones in green are the ones that are valid to this circumstance. So it's a pace bowler. The batter made contact with the ball. They didn't score any runs. A whole bunch of stuff. And based on all of that data, these 4 lines could have played because they matched the description. So the one that did play was not a great ball, got it full, and lucky not to concede a boundary. Again, I can't help but imitate Michael Atherton when he does that. But it could have also played, floated that one up, hit well, but couldn't beat the field. So yeah, it's quite an interesting system where you have like a top tier bucket of lines, and then one rung down from there, it evaluates very specific things about the game state and about what just happened, and then selects a line based on that. So yeah, we're only seeing a slight snippet of the script here, but there's, I think, 12,000 lines in the whole script, spread over different commentators. So yeah, making sure that sounds play at the correct time is a really big task when we're building like a complex dialogue system like this. Cool. So that is one challenge with sound design for video games, making sure things play at the right time, whether it's someone walking through a door and the sound trailing behind the vision, like I described before, or whether it's just a sheer number of assets and making sure the right one plays at the right time, like in the commentary system. And I suppose ancillary to that is, the idea that anything can happen at any time. When you're playing a game, the user's very much in control. Like for instance, with the cricket game, something that you can do is a dead ball. So that's where you're running up to bowl, but you don't actually bowl. You sort of bail out of it. And this happens in real life, right? People do that for whatever reason. The leg hurts or something. But in the game, you can just keep doing it. You could do it again and again and again. Like you might be on the couch with a friend playing a cricket game, and just to annoy them, you do it 8 times in a row. In the real world, this is unheard of. That would never happen. But it's something that us as sound designers would have to maybe consider. Like, what if the user does this thing? Like, do we have commentary lines for it? Do we get the crowd to boo and yell and all this sort of thing? You sort of really have to brainstorm and imagine all the edge case scenarios that could happen in a game. We do both of those things. We scripted dialogue lines for like, oh, this is unbelievable. It's so unsportsmanlike. this sort of thing, and the crowd is like yelling at you when you do that. You know, another example, like you could get a stacking up of events, you know, in a different sort of game, not a sports game, like you might like swing your sword at the same time as like a loud bit in the music, which could be at the same time as a loud bit in the ambience. You know, you really don't have control over when things happen. In a film situation, that would be really easily dealt with. You would maybe get the composer to rearrange the music slightly so that the crescendo is not on a dialogue. And then with the ambience, you might just mute that bit of the ambience or move it or something. But with game audio, you don't know the sequence of things that are going to happen. So yeah, these things could stack up on top of each other. So the solution to that sort of thing is having a systematic approach and brainstorming those edge cases, like I mentioned before. And like the main solution to that is to prioritize certain sounds to take precedence over others. For instance, you know, you might have the sword swing duck the ambience, just in case that doesn't happen. Or an example in the cricket game is we've got the commentator, but we've also got the PA announcer that's sort of diegetic in the world. And in rare circumstances, they can actually talk at the same time. So our solution for that was the commentator ducks the announcer. So if the announcer's talking and then the commentator starts talking, the announcer drops quite a bit. So yeah, that was a fairly easy solution to that one. And yeah, the last point here is, you know, there's so many combinations of outcomes. Usually too many to test. And so, again, with the brainstorming of edge cases, trying to imagine the worst case scenarios and trying to build into the system design a way to make sure the bad case doesn't happen, whatever it may be. An example of that that we faced with the cricket game is we released the cricket game a month or two ago, and we were getting reports on social media that you can't hear the bat sound. And that's pretty bad as a sound designer for a cricket game. You'd like the bat sound to be audible. It's kind of the number one thing, right? But people were saying on Twitter and whatever, we can't hear the bat sound. So I was kind of freaking out a little bit. And we eventually dug down and figured out what the problem was. This exact combination of circumstances led to the bat sound being inaudible. So we've got different stadiums in different cities around the world in the game. So that there's a category of stadium that I've called subcontinental. So this might be India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. And they have a particularly loud ambience. That's because those places where they play cricket, it's very loud. So we tried to match that. So yeah, we've got a very loud ambience, more so than other stadiums in the game. You can also select which camera you're looking through. There's like 12 options or something. And this one is the furthest away from the action. You can see it here. So we have great distance from the camera to the batter. That combined with the fact that it's a loud ambience meant that in this specific circumstance you can't hear the bat sound. So yeah, there's a very unfortunate design flaw on our end, or my end I should say, something that we remedied in a subsequent patch. But it's just an example of, you know, there being a large number of outcomes that can occur, many that you have to brainstorm and think about, but also test. And this is one that's, you know, slipped through to the keeper, to use a cricket metaphor. Another example, so we have these particle effects in the games, and these are things like fireworks and flame jets and flame sparklers and all this showman sort of stuff. And yeah, we have sounds for all of these things. And yeah, so the problem that we faced here is that there were just too many of them, right? There were so many of them happening all at once. And it was actually pretty funny. Like, I made the sounds for it, I put them and tied them to the particle effects, and like I knew that I wasn't done. I just wanted to check if they played in the first place, because that's usually the first step. You put a sound in the game and then you fire it up just to see if it does anything, because sometimes it does nothing. And yeah, I booted it up and it went into the opening sequence, and oh yeah, it played. It was one of those moments where you just quickly whip the headphones off because it was so loud. And it's because there were just so many instances of these particle effects, and they were all at like full volume. So the first solution for that is to make them attenuated over distance, which is a really common thing with game audio. You know, you have maybe your camera position, which sort of acts as like the microphone in the world, if you want to think of it that way. And you can set it up so that if something happens 20 meters away, it's attenuated appropriately 10 meters away. You know what I mean? So that was the first thing that we did to remedy that volume situation. But the other problem we faced is that, you know, these opening cutscenes, they have all these different camera angles that can play out. So we load into one of these opening sequences and there's like 18 different camera sequences. And what that means is some of these flame effects you don't actually see. But when they're all tied to the effects, they're still playing, you just don't see it. So your camera could be here, it could be looking at nothing, and then there's this giant sound behind you. So that was a big problem. So the solution there was to, you know, systematically design it in a way that, let me start again. The solution there was when we load into a game, we import references to all the particle effects that we're going to see, because once we're in the game, we already know what the camera sequence will be, and from that we can determine which flame jet particles we are going to see. And based on that, we can either mute or unmute specific ones. So that was a big job. This took maybe 2 days of work to get that right. And it was an iterative process, you know. We got it kind of halfway there and it was pretty good, and then we kept working on it and tweaking values and that sort of thing. So I have 2 progress videos. So the first one is when I would consider it almost there, and then the second video is a slight improvement on it. So let's have a look at that one.
So the decision's made to bat first in what could just about be called bowler-friendly conditions. Both captains will be happy enough.
Oh, it's a loud crowd as the players make their way out. Some really strong players on both sides, capable of scoring quick runs, big hits, and the bowlers, they'll be looking to take quick wickets. The pitch, that should provide a fantastic contest. Opening ball coming up. They're nicely settled in the commentary boxing.
So, I mean, it was pretty good, but there were a lot of particle effects that we can hear, but maybe only half see or not see at all. So yeah, that was an example of a camera sequence that was quite unlucky, because you can see like the apparatus for the flame jet here, but you don't actually see the flame, and yet the sound of it is really loud. Yeah, so that's what we would call a progress iteration. And then here's another one which we're probably a bit happier with.
Must have a lot of faith in their batting lineup. I reckon I would have thrown the ball to my bowlers to start with.
So the players are making their way out now. It's a fantastic atmosphere. These are the moments as a player you never get tired of. And there should be plenty of runs on offer, so expect some fireworks. The crowd are making a heck of a lot of noise even before the first ball.
That one was definitely an improvement. I think that's closer to what we released with. But yeah, you can see the sheer number of particle effects going on. And hopefully I sort of explained the situation adequately. You know, there's the ones on screen, but then there's a ton more happening that you're not seeing because the camera angle is only looking this way. Hopefully I sort of explained the situation there.
David?
Yes.
In that last shot where you're looking right across the ground and they fired off on the roof, there was apparently no delay in the sound being heard. Do you ever take that into account, the distance?
Yeah.
See if you were at the ground?
Yeah, that is something that we took into account. The question was, if you didn't hear it, in the last shot there's distant fireworks and there wasn't a sound delay appropriate to it. We did think about that, but the problem, again, was the fireworks are happening all around the stadium. And so, like, the camera's here looking that way very far, but then there's ones behind us firing upwards. So it was sort of a compromise that we had no delay there because we're actually hearing the ones behind us in addition to the ones in front. So it probably appears like there isn't a delay. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's another really good point. It adds to the problematic situation that we're trying to design around.
Are you mixing in stereo there?
Yeah.
Are you placing the sounds?
Oh yes, so they're all tied to the positions. Yes.
Are you actually mixing in like stereo, or are you using Atmos?
It's interesting. So the question was, are we mixing in stereo or Atmos or surround sound? The interesting thing about the game engines that we use is that they're sort of adaptive to what the user plugs in, because the games are technically released on any format, and it's really determined by what the user plugs it into. Where if they're listening on headphones, they get stereo. If they're listening on a soundbar or something like that, they get whatever spec the soundbar claims to be, like 11.14 or whatever. So yeah, to answer your question, certain elements of the soundscape are processed in a way where it can facilitate those higher channel counts. It uses a vector-based positional system. The particle effects are positioned in 3D space. So like in this shot right here, there's particle effects behind the camera, and I talked about how we tried to mute them, but if it wasn't muted, they would be positioned behind us in the surround field. Hopefully that sort of makes sense, that explanation. In a short word, it's adaptive to what the user is using.
But do you have to like spec it for the highest end, and then the software down mixes it according to the user's hardware?
Sort of. I suppose, speccing to the higher end, not really. Yeah, it's a tricky question to answer.
Could you possibly repeat the question?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question was, when we're mixing and designing, do we mix with the highest order format in mind? I think maybe I'm paraphrasing incorrectly. Or do we mix in stereo? So I guess my process with this, and maybe this isn't a standardized process, but I do most of the work in stereo. But as I'm setting things up, I'm thinking about the possibility of surround sound and various other formats as I go. We did a day of mixing in 7.1. I had to think for a moment which it was. Because it's not necessarily channel-based like it is in film, it's adaptive. My thinking was, if I sort of cover myself with 7.1 or something like that. It could be 5-1, it could be 7-1-4. But if I sort of cover myself and just check that everything kind of lays itself out nicely in something like 7-1, that's nice, and it did to a certain degree. And then doing a lot more checking on things like immersive audio formats, like Windows computers, for instance. Oh, no, you're not seeing that. Sorry, hang on. Get out of it. There we go. So, like, an example is Windows computers. They have this this spatial sound, and there's Windows Sonic for headphones, and these are there'd be some version of ambisonics for binaural. So these are ways of emulating in a really quick way how it might translate into some sort of 3D environment. The other thing we test on a lot, I didn't mention this before, but these games are released on PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X. So one of the things that I test on, I do a big focus on the PlayStation 5 mix, because PlayStation 5 has its own really specific thing, which is sort of based on third-order ambisonics. So yeah, I will boot up PlayStation 5 and see if the mix translates to that environment, and that's usually a pretty good test case for how it'll go with different formats. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Yep.
Because you just mentioned PS5 there, and I was got a question about it.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't know if this game applies to it as well, but I know the PS5 controller can play sound.
Oh yeah.
Do you make noises to mix them to come out of the controller that can sound good?
Right. Yeah, it does. Yeah. So the question is, PlayStation 5 has this facility where the controller itself has a speaker, and you can have sound come out of the controller that you're holding in addition to whatever you're listening to it on. And the answer is for these games we didn't use any of that. We sort of thought about it, but I couldn't really think of. Well, I did have ideas of things that might be cool, but I just didn't explore them.
I don't actually use the sound of the controller anyway.
Oh, okay.
I always put a headset in anyway. But
Right. Yeah, it was something we thought of, but yeah, we didn't. Maybe in other games we'll explore the controller speaker a bit more. Yeah. Yeah, cool. How do we get this going again? There we go. Cool. So just a short bit about the pipeline of assets that we use. One distinction between game audio and other fields is that we're not really working with tracks at all. We're sort of working with individual assets, individual sounds as files, and then we sort of group them together in buses and mix the buses and that sort of thing. But a lot of what we do is working with individual assets. So this might be a pretty typical workflow. This screenshot here is that man walks through door sequence, which I know is your favourite, of course. There's that sound, door opening, door closing, all very good and snazzy. So you export from your design software, whatever it may be, into your assets folder, and then you import it into some sort of audio management software, usually known as middleware. So the one we use is Audio Kinetic Wise. The other big competitor to Wise is Fmod, which is actually Melbourne-based. So yeah, Fmod and Wise are the two main ones in the industry, I'd probably say. So this sort of talks with the game. You set it up so that the game code is constantly communicating with Wise, and when the game wants to play a sound, it plays it from Wise, if that makes sense. So this is just looking at your assets folder at the end of the day. It's referencing all of your sounds in the assets folder. It has mixing capabilities. You can put EQs and that sort of thing. But if you want to drastically change a sound, usually you go to the assets folder and edit the sound file. I like to use Isotope RX for that because it's really quick and easy. You can just open the sound, change it, hit save, and it's the edit is already there. You don't have to rename it or anything like that. Or if there's a major sort of design change you want to make, you usually go back to the session and re-export it with your edition there. So that's kind of the pipeline of sounds as they make their way into the game. Cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to get into the industry and what the expectations are. For better or worse, the application process that you're expected to follow in the games industry is quite standardized, which is very different to other areas of audio engineering. There's no standard process to get a job in the film industry, for instance. But for the game industry, it has become standardized. And it is generally agreed upon that the things that I've written here are sort of the way to go with your application. And some job ads will specifically say, like, do these things. And they're pretty similar to what I have written here. So CV and cover sheet, that's pretty standard. But the big thing that gets looked at is your sound design show reel. So if you've worked in the industry, presumably your show reel would have stuff that you've worked on. But if you haven't worked in the industry and you're going for a junior position or an entry-level position, you are still expected to have a design reel. And that would usually take the form of redesigns, is what we call it. So you would take footage from a game and take the sound away and recreate all the sound for the sequence. So the standard sort of expected show reel is 60 seconds. And when I say that to people, a lot of people sort of think like, oh, that's really short. Like, why is it so short? But, to have 60 seconds of like kind of dense, intricate sound design is a big deal. It takes a long time to build up to that level. 60 seconds is actually quite a lot. The other reason why people like 60-second reels when they're reviewing applications is because, they might have 80 applications they need to go through and they like to keep it brief. So I think because of those two reasons, the difficulty and, not boring people on the other end, the 60 seconds is sort of the benchmark for that sort of thing. The show reel is really quite challenging. It's sort of one of those things where you do one of them and then, you change one thing and then you change another thing, you keep changing it, and then all of a sudden you've got a completely different show reel. My approach to the whole show reel thing was to get it to a presentable level, make a link on YouTube for it, so that I'm ready to go with an application. If a job comes up, I already have the show reel ready to present. But as soon as I upload it, I'll immediately keep working on it because, it's one of those things that's never truly done, I suppose. It's time consuming to develop that thing to the level that you're expected to have it at to get even a junior position. The other thing that's not always required but sometimes expected is a technical show reel. So these could be a little bit longer. I don't think there's any standardized time limit on it like the design reel. But the technical show reel is more like you demonstrating your ability to come up with that system design approach that I've been talking about throughout the presentation. Like any of these things that I've talked about, like the commentary system or the commentary system or the particle effects thing that I talked about before, those are the sorts of things that maybe you would put on a technical show reel, just to demonstrate that you have that systematic approach to to video game sound design. The convention with the technical showreel is that you also narrate it, so like you're talking about it as they're viewing it. You know, like my one's a bit embarrassing, but it's sort of like, hi, welcome to my technical showreel. Today I'm going to be talking about ... that sort of thing. So that's what's expected, and both of those things are very time-consuming and will take quite a while to develop. And on a lot of even entry-level job positions, listed as bonus points are the following things. Stuff like knowledge of game engines. So the common game engines are Unity and Unreal Engine. At Big Ant, we don't use either. We've got our own custom engine, but a lot of places where you would get employment use either Unity or Unreal Engine. So they're often listed on job postings. Another bonus is knowledge of coding languages, something like C# or C++, and then knowledge of version control software like Git. So yeah, there's pretty high expectation for this sort of thing. And remember, the context of this presentation is how do we teach students about this stuff, and how do we sort of enable them to get employment in this field. So yeah, the question that I have on the screen there, is it possible to cram job readiness into a single unit of study? You know, is it possible to cram all of this stuff into a single unit of study? And I think the answer is probably no. I think it's way too much. Just a quick point about that, though. You know, like it's important to keep perspective. You know, the number one goal for a unit of study isn't always to make someone job ready. It should definitely be a high priority, but not everyone in the classroom is there because they need to get a job. You know, a lot of people might be there because they're just interested in game audio. You know, maybe they really want to do music production, but they took the game audio unit because they were interested. You know, so the only priority shouldn't be job readiness, is the point that I'm trying to get across here. But of course it is important. We want to train students for the best possibility. So my conclusion from all of this is that the things that we should focus on in a game audio unit are the things I have in yellow, and then mentioning the other things, basically. So instilling a sense of that sound design mentality is very important. You know, the reason why I sort of emphasize this is because, you know, as someone who's taught in the audio engineering program, I've always found it quite difficult to get across the message about how sound design is distinctly different from audio engineering. You know, I mentioned early on that students and recent graduates, they tend to put a lot of music into their sound design show reels or projects. You know, these sorts of things are crucial to highlight if you're teaching game audio at a university. So sound design mentality, knowledge about the industry, expectations of employers, you know, basically telling them that this is sort of the goal beyond that unit of study to aim for if they're looking for employment. Industry knowledge, practice with middleware, something like Wise, like I mentioned before. There was like a little screen grab of Wise, but just a little bit of hands-on knowledge with those industry tools that are quite unique to the video game industry. And really importantly, giving them a roadmap of where to from here if they're interested in pursuing a career in game audio. Cool. So that's all I have for you. Hopefully it all made sense. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, yeah. I'll get a mic coming. So I can repeat the question back, Dan.
I have a question while we're playing with the microphone.
Sure.
the environments like WISE and FMOD,
Yes.
are they applicable to the game environment or the view environment of the user, or both?
What do you mean, the view environment?
If you're looking at the view environment, you've got to change the parameters for things like WISE and FMOD based on each individual viewer, whereas it could be in the context of just the general game, and you take a view from that. Which one of those is that too hard?
Yeah, I'm not fully sure what you.
Well, if you get a context of FMOD
Yeah.
in the game, you could place things. But then each time a person takes a view, they're going to need a modifier.
What do you mean by view? Sorry.
Or taking their observation of the game. So they. Yes, they're in the gameplay and they're looking at their particular perspective of that game.
If you've got multiple people playing.
Yes. So are those tools applicable to just the core game, or are they applicable to being changed as each person changes their view or has a different view?
Yeah. So it adapts to the viewer's view and position. Yeah. So it's adaptive. Sometimes those tools like WISE, they're sort of marketed as being for adaptive audio. That's sort of a keyword that they like to throw around. If I understand your question correctly, you've got a player in the game and you're moving around, and yes, the audio will sort of, if the sound design is adequate, the audio will adapt to your movement. Yeah. So one of the main things is in a game environment there will be a listener. That's what we call it, a listener. For our stuff, it's typically where the camera is. So what the camera sees is also what the camera hears, including distance and angle. So if you're in our game and I'm the camera and you're speaking and I'm looking over here, your sound source is positioned where you're standing. And if I move away from you, you continue to pan to the right and you get more distant. I think the second part of your question was if there's multiple people playing the game, they each have their own listener based on their camera. So they'll hear different things. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave. Yep. Thank you for your presentation. So I just had a question about what your perspective of how game audio really should be, represented at either a tertiary level or vocational education. You mentioned that it's difficult to encompass that within the context of just one unit, and I know that that's been something that you've worked on as well, and it becomes quite dense. So, in your opinion, and how do you think that training or education should be structured around game audio to give it enough space to really visit all of the concepts, as well as make students industry and job ready?
I think ideally you'd have 2 or 3 units actually. Is that cheating? Is that a cheating way to answer? I suppose in a, if I could build a course from the ground up, there'd be like a game audio stream or maybe a media stream, and where game audio is concerned, there could be a unit based on the sound design, and then a different unit based on the technical sort of stuff. So, you could kind of develop this in one unit, because I feel like that's a unit's worth of content. Maybe you don't believe me because it's just 60 seconds, but that's my belief. I feel like this is probably 1 unit's worth of content. And then, this guy, the technical stuff and the middleware practice, that could be a secondary unit. Doing both of them to the standard that's generally required for an entry-level position would be very difficult, I think. I think that... Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And just a follow-up question. Yourself and your colleagues, I imagine, have some prior established, as you've demonstrated today, experience with audio engineering and a number of other things, musicality being one of them. What is if you were designing training around this, what would your expectation be of the skills and experience that a student might have at the level of entering, doing these units or this training?
Interesting question. I mean, I feel like you could design it for potentially any level of progression through the course. You'd probably just adapt the content to suit, really. Interesting question. I suppose in my mind, in most courses, courses are structured differently, but in most courses you might do a film and television kind of unit fairly early on, and then if that can precede the game audio unit, they would have a much smoother time, because it's a lot of the same concepts, things like Foley and the difference between sound effects and Foley and how you use ambiences in a film track. So those skills will be directly applicable. But if the game audio unit came before that, or if there wasn't a film and television unit, I suppose you'd cover those things. Quite likely the students coming into it would have quite a bit of knowledge about EQ and reverbs and mixing principles. And that's going to obviously help a lot when sequencing sounds and getting them all to fit together. I feel like, just tackling the sound designer mentality kind of leads into those other more technical skills quite smoothly. Like, I feel like if you teach sound design from a really principled approach, if that makes sense, the other stuff kind of follows suit. So what I'm trying to get at is if you have a game audio unit quite early in the progression, those other skills will follow.
Sure. So, sorry, Graham, I just want to... just another follow-up with that. So, you've sort of spoken about some pre-established, say, digital audio workstation skills, understand your way around EQ and compression. What I'm wondering is, can you use some of this content to establish those skills? That would mean that it could, the training could be introduced into a screen and media stream, where sound design is another element, and this could be a potential. So, is this a potential avenue there, or is it really important to have those pre-established skills in Pro Tools or whatnot prior to that?
No, I don't think so. Actually, I think a student early in the course, it's an interesting one. Like when you design a unit, you like to have like the software firmly established. But I think it's perfectly fine for them to be new to software, like whether it's Pro Tools or whatever they're using. I think it's fine to sort of learn those steps as you go. If lesson one is doing like a sequence where a guy walks through a door, perhaps, show them how to import a sound, show them how to move it around, and then those other technical skills will follow. Obviously, if the unit happens later in the course where they've already done a whole bunch of recording and mixing, that part will be quicker. But I don't think it's necessarily essential that they're like highly proficient in a DAW before getting into it. Hopefully I'm answering your question.
We have a couple of questions online.
Oh, yes.
And you can't see them.
Yeah, the screen's
So
going to
I'll read
sleep.
them out
After
for
my
you.
whole spiel at the beginning about how I was going to read them.
Well, it's the first one is from Octamed, and the question is standard audio mastering still used in real-time games, e.g. compression, EQ, etc.? Can FMOD allow audio engineers to use their same skills in a real-time dynamic environment?
That's a really interesting question. So I don't know about FMOD, but WISE is what we use, and we do have like a mastering, what would you call it? like a mastering layer. It's a bit, how do I explain this? So all the assets get bussed into buses. You know, you might have ambience, sound effects, vocals, whatever, and then they go to a master bus, very similar to a DAW. And Wise offers a mastering module placed on the master output. The complication, like I was talking about before, is that these systems will adapt to whatever format the user plugs their game into. So you can't really guarantee that it's going to be stereo or 5.1. Well, you could guarantee it. You could force it to always be stereo, but then, you know, your game wouldn't be in surround sound. So yeah, in terms of traditional mastering principles, like the
Compression EQ.
yeah, it's a bit trickier because you know, if you have compression on the master bus and the game's being played in stereo, it's going to respond in a certain way. But then if you plug it into 7.1, you know, the thresholds aren't going to make sense anymore, really, because now the sounds are spread around. You've got different signal on different channels. In my experience, it doesn't always translate.
So do you ignore it, or do you?
No, you
make it
don't. You don't ignore
specific?
it. I suppose I do more mixing at the sub bus level.
Okay.
So maybe you do like mastering on the dialogue channel, if you want to call it that, or like mastering on the sound effects channel, and that way everything's kind of compartmentalized. And then in my mind, regardless of whether it's being played out over ambisonics or just headphones, everything will sort of sit into its place and translate across different formats.
That's good. I don't know if Octamed's got some further comments. The second one is from Sean Wilkinson. Hey, David, awesome talk.
Oh, thanks,
I
Sean.
guess you know him.
Yes.
Stick figures for life. Question, is the dialogue VO record for commentary outsourced or recorded in-house, and are you the one that handles those sessions? That's a very specific question.
Yeah.
Is he looking for an employment opportunity?
So the commentary for our games doesn't always happen in Melbourne. You know, we're doing rugby commentary at the moment, and the commentator's in Wales. I'm doing that tomorrow, actually. So I'm remoting in on Zoom. There's a studio in Wales. No, sorry, it's not Wales, it's Manchester. But there's a studio in Manchester that I'm remoting into. So I'm not handling the engineering of that, but I'm handling like the session, I guess. Like I've got the script and I'm going through it and I guess directing the session. For the AFL commentary we did, that was all in Melbourne. And I was doing the same thing, like handling the script and handling the session, but in the same building, not over Zoom. So no, we don't do it in-house. It's outsourced to an extent, but we're involved.
Well, I hope that answers Sean's question.
I hope so too.
Any more questions?
I'm curious to know how the user interfaces with the game. Do you pick a player, like if there's, I don't know, 11, 12 players in a team or whatever? I mean, are you a player, or do you control more than one player, or is it a team playing thing? Do you get together with mates and they all choose a role, or how does that work?
Yeah. So the question,
and then that triggers, I guess, events in the game, or does the game have some inbuilt sequences?
So the question's about what role do you have as a player, whether you're a team or a specific player. And actually, well, in the cricket game, there's both scenarios. You can play a mode where you're one player, regardless of who's batting or bowling. Your player might be fielding, which is a dull affair sometimes. But typically the gameplay is you're playing as the team. So if your team's bowling, you control the bowler. When the ball goes over there, you control the fielder. And if you're playing with a friend, usually they're on the other team, they're batting as that's taking place. That's the typical sort of way it's played. For the AFL game, you're not controlling one player, you're controlling the team. And your, what would you say, your influence over the individual players is sort of contextual. So like if the ball comes to someone on your team, you take control of that player. And then when you kick it off, you take control of the person you kick to, and it sort of moves around like that. Yeah. Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
So as a follow-up to that,
Yes.
if you're playing the AFL game, you're controlling the team as the player.
Mm-hmm.
Who or what controls what the opposition team does?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, who or what controls what the opposition team does in AFL? Yeah, there's an AI system in the game. And yeah, I mean, the programming for that is pretty dense, as you can imagine. It's not something that I deal with in my role. But, you know, on a basic level, I suppose the AI would position the players so that they have a good chance of getting the ball if it comes over here. If you have the ball and an AI player is near you, they'll run towards you. Basic things like that, and then more complex things on top of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Does the game technology limit you to generate sound? My example would be probably like 20 aircraft flying at different distances greatly, busting the sound barrier, including standing wave effects and that. And then you probably have to have 20 audio tracks. Can you put 20 audio tracks in a sound game in the game to generate that effect?
Yeah, questions about limitations. Yeah, I mean, we can have quite a few sounds playing simultaneously. Yeah, much more than 20. You could probably have a couple of hundred, maybe. Your question was specifically about the interaction between sounds.
Sound waves from a distance, but you know there are different timing, but also you have some of them synchronised as well. There could be two at the same distance, but two at another distance because they're coming from different directions.
Yeah, so what you're describing would be very, very challenging to implement. So I suppose, you know, the first thing about that is like when there's a sound playing somewhere, there is an inherently a distance delay applied to it. And that was kind of highlighted by one of the previous questions or comments about the fireworks. So the delay would have to be calculated and built in on our end. You know, the sound wave interaction between sounds is not something that would come natively with the game engine or the audio systems. If we wanted that effect, it would be something that we would have to synthesize on our end. You know, if you wanted that effect of like two, sorry, I've forgotten your scenario exactly, but if there were two planes crossing, I think you said, and the standing waves coming from that, or the phase interference coming from that, that would be something that we would have to, I guess, synthesize, predict and synthesize and implement as its own sort of entity. It wouldn't be calculated natively. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Question.
What's that, sorry?
20 aircraft.
20, 20, not just two. Yeah. Yeah. Too simple, yeah, right.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
It was a very interesting presentation, a great insight into your industry. I've got a question that's not related to gaming. Sorry, is that working? Not close enough.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing because I'm just about to say I'm an acoustic engineer that clearly doesn't know how to use a microphone. Yeah. My question is, so for me as an acoustic engineer, I work regularly with architects in the built environment, and it's quite clear that architectural practices for many years have benefited from the video rendering technology that's come out of the gaming industry to do the real-time fly-throughs with beautiful buildings, with rousing music in the background or whatever it is. What you don't see or hear very often is an audio rendering. of that environment. The acoustic industry has been able to do that for static scenes, if you like, so recreating the acoustic of a theatre or a concert hall for a given seat position, and then being able to demonstrate to a client how that sound might change if you change the shape of the reflectors above the orchestra, all rendered over headphones or an ambisonic sound system. So coming back to the question, it's a two-part question. Are you seeing anything from your perspective as the sound designer that's moving into a sort of technical engineering area rather than gaming production? So I'm not asking the question properly. Are you seeing any advances into that more engineering, 3D rendering space with the technology that you use and your skills? And secondly, other areas you might move into?
Yeah. So is your question like some of the technology coming from gaming, is it applicable to architecture and acoustic engineering in rendering and that sort of thing?
Correct, exactly.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. Not so much our games, because our games are sort of sports games, they're outside a lot of the time. But a lot of games do use adaptive reverbs that literally look at the space and calculate how far away walls are and adapt the reverb to match that sort of thing. So I see no reason why that couldn't be adapted to architectural models. So one of the principles involved with that is ray tracing. So the system spits out lines in different directions, calculates the distance until it hits an object, and then it knows where the boundaries are, and it's able to sort of render simulated acoustics based on that. My understanding of that is it's highly computer intensive to do that. So with advancements in computer technology, that could get more and more accurate. To the extent where maybe you could one day in architectural software like Revit or something like that, you could place a sound source and a listener and have it calculate the acoustics based on that. The reason why I know Revit and Enscape is my partner's an architect, so that's how I was able to name drop that product. But I definitely see that technology being able to come across. Yeah. Did you have a second part to the question?
I've got so many questions. I'm glad you stopped me halfway through. It was really just a broader question as to what other areas you potentially see sound design morphing into other than the gaming and movie industries, or whether there are other applications that are on the horizon. That might be a difficult question to finish off with.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think definitely like simulated education could be an interesting one. I mean, they're already doing that. But yeah, I mean, audio in that sort of world is one of those aspects that makes things more real. And I think we will see lots of simulated education, stuff like games essentially, but for educational purposes, like imagine, a surgeon, they might have like a surgery simulator, that sort of thing. Implementing sounds into that sort of thing would make it feel more real, and I think that's important, because the closer you can get it to the real thing, the better they prepare whatever they're trying to prepare for. That's my answer.
Rod, did you have a question? Okay. Any other questions? Have we got anything online, Peter? No. Okay. Well, that has been a very informative session for me, and I hope you all enjoyed it too. There's a lot in this gaming industry, and there's going to be a lot more in the future. I want to thank you, David, for coming along and spending your time with us today and our wider audience. And I hope that you'll get a few questions coming in, because I think our questioning system wasn't quite up for it. But I would really like to thank you, and I'd like to ask the people here to join with me in giving a round of applause to David to thank him for that. So thank you very much.